Something he doesn't often do, but the 39th president is blunt in his Washington Post profile, saying, quote, "I think he is a disaster in human rights and taking care of people and treating people equal." And tonight we're learning what another president might have thought, and that's Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan's daughter, Patty Davis, has an opinion piece in the Washington Post titled, "My Father, Ronald Reagan, Would Never Have Stood for This." Patty Davis joins me now. Good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us, Patty.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. You just heard what President Carter, his comments about President Trump. Former presidents don't often speak out about the current one, the sitting president. But President Trump seems to be testing that practice. What do you think your father would have to say?
I think my father would be appalled, but I think he would also be really heartbroken at where this country has come to and where we have sunk to. And I think he would be frightened at the use of the word enemy toward the media. You know, the word enemy is really a very strategic word if you think about it, because if you call someone the enemy, you've dehumanized them. You've made them into a target, really. And I think it's even broader than just calling the media the enemy. You've stoked fear in people. You've stoked fear in this country just by invoking the word enemy. I heard a quote years ago that I believe was attributed to Ceausescu, the Romanian dictator who was executed in '89. I'm not 100% positive it was Ceausescu, so don't hold me to that. But the quote was, "You can do whatever you want if you keep the people frightened enough." And I think that is the agenda of this administration. And I think my father would see it that way, because my father, unlike this president, knew history. He knew what happened in Nazi Germany. He knew what has happened historically in Russia and in other tyrannical regimes.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting when you talked to us. The first time I thought about this, you know, he calls the press the enemy of the people, and then he calls Russia a competitor.
Yeah.
He thinks the press is worse than Russia or, you know, someone like Vladimir Putin, who's a dictator and people has people murdered in his country. And listen to the way he talks about the press. Watch this.
We have a very crooked media.
We're also thrilled to have a lot of the fake news media in the back.
Good morning to the media, the legitimate media, and the fake news media.
It's time to expose the crooked media deceptions and to challenge the media for their role in fomenting divisions. A few days ago, I called the fake news the enemy of the people, and they are. They are the enemy of the people.
How dangerous is this tone?
I think it's incredibly dangerous because, you know, here's the thing. Donald Trump and the people around him told us what they were going to do. Steve Bannon talked about blowing things up and tearing things down and, what was it, deconstructing the administrative state or something like that. It was something, deconstructing something. They told us what they were going to do. Donald Trump stood in front of people, the press, America, and talked about how bad America was right now, and he alone could fix it. They told us what they were going to do. In the same way that in Nazi Germany, Hitler told people what they were going to do and assumed that no one was going to get in his way. And Donald Trump has assumed that no one would get in his way. And so far, if you look at the silence of Congress, he's right.
What do you think about...
our system of... go on.
What do you think about the Republican Party now? Because the Republican... No one, people behind closed doors, as you know, or away from cameras or recordings, people will say, I don't agree with this, I can't believe he's doing that, and they have disdain for what the president's doing. But no one will say it publicly. What do you think about the Republican Party now?
I think it's so cowardly. It's like they all turned into eunuchs. I apologize to any eunuchs out there who are offended by that comparison, but but they really have, you know. It doesn't matter what you say behind closed doors. It matters what you say out in public to this country. That's what people elected you to do, to speak to us.
There's always been tension between...
And, you know, go on.
There's always been tensions between the presidents and the press. Your father, no exception, but you say he tried to reach compromises with the media. Explain that.
Well, the example that I gave in this piece was up at his ranch. They had long lenses up on a hillside, way far away from the ranch house, but they could see actually into the ranch house. And, you know, he said, well, this is not going to do. I mean, they can't. This is really an intrusion. So we have to reach a compromise. But before they came to that compromise, he stepped outside of the ranch house, swayed like something was wrong with him, clutched his chest, and fell to the ground
right?
And stayed there for a couple of seconds. It felt like he was having a heart attack. And then stood up and smiled and waved at them up on the hill, right? The Secret Service was in on this prank, otherwise they would all have been rushed to hospitals with heart attacks or something, you know? So he did have a sense of humor about it. Yeah. But he also had enormous respect for the press. And, you know, in the Iran-Contra scandal, he initially came in front of the press, came in front of America, and said there were no arms for hostages. And I think it was like the next day that Ed Meese came to him with a document and said, actually, Mr. President, we found out there were. He went back in front of the press, I think that night. Yeah. He went back in front of the country and back in front of the media and said, I sincerely believe that I was right in what I told you yesterday, but as it turns out, I was wrong.
Well, that would not happen with this administration. They'll figure out a way to say that the information you have is wrong, and they'll say the intelligence is not accurate about that. I've got to run, though, Patty. Thank you so much. You're welcome back anytime. It's a pleasure to have you on. Thanks.
Thank you, Don.
Yeah. When we come back, the New York Times reporting that Omarosa could have as many as 200 secretly recorded tapes. So, is it any surprise that a worried White House is trying to change the subject?
This is not a bet. It's a revolution.
Have a great weekend. This is CNN Tonight. I'm Don Lemon. We have breaking news in the Russia investigation to tell you about. The special counsel Robert Mueller is recommending a sentence of up to 6 months in jail for former Trump campaign staffer George Papadopoulos, who pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI. And we have more breaking news to tell you about as well. President Trump doubling down on his enemies list tonight. The White House has reportedly drafted multiple documents revoking the security clearances of the critics the president wants to punish. And one senior official says they have discussed timing the release of those documents as a distraction during news cycles unfavorable to the president. That's according to the Washington Post. And this latest effort to distract and deflect comes as 60 former CIA officials have signed a letter warning President Trump that, quote, the country will be weakened if there is a political litmus test applied before seasoned experts are allowed to share their views. That's on top of 15 former intel officials who have already issued a similar statement in response to the president's decision earlier this week to revoke the security clearance of ex-CIA chief John Brennan. But the president, well, he says this.
There's no silence. If anything, I'm giving him a bigger voice. Many people don't even know who he is, and now he has a bigger voice, and that's okay with me because I like taking on voices like that.
Well, that's as President Trump tries to defend his former campaign chairman as a jury in Virginia ends a second day of deliberations in the Manafort trial with no verdict in sight.
I think the whole Manafort trial is very sad. When you look at what's going on there, I think it's a very sad day for our country.
Well, now that is absolutely true. It is a very sad day for our country. It's a very sad day for our country when a candidate for the highest office in the nation puts his campaign in the hands of a man like Paul Manafort. The man Donald Trump chose to help him get elected is on trial on charges that could land him in jail for the rest of his life if he's convicted on all of them. But the president, rather than keeping quiet and letting justice take its course, lashes out at the man prosecuting Manafort, and that's Robert Mueller.
Mr. Mueller is highly conflicted. In fact, Comey is like his best friend. I could go into conflict after conflict. But sadly, Mr. Mueller is conflicted. But let him write his report. We did nothing. There's no collusion.
Here we go again. The old, I know you are, but what am I strategy. Robert Mueller is a former director of the FBI who was nominated by President George W. Bush. His appointment as special counsel has been upheld by 4 federal judges, most recently by a judge appointed to the bench by President Trump himself. But that didn't stop Trump from returning to the baseless charge he's thrown around again and again.
Look, I say it again. That whole situation is a rigged witch hunt. It's a totally rigged deal. They should be looking at the other side.
So the fact is, Mueller's investigation has already resulted in 191 criminal charges against 35 defendants and 5 guilty pleas so far. And in the face of all this, the White House is scrambling to spin the president's actions. Kellyanne Conway today offering a defense you might call, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Why is everybody so obsessed with the President of the United States that they can't even begin or finish a sentence without mentioning his name 5 times? It's kind of weird.
Well, Donald Trump is a man who always needs an enemy, someone to blame, especially now, with ex-aide Omarosa potentially holding as many as 200 secretly recorded tapes of Team Trump, and with the possibility of a presidential interview with Robert Mueller looming. Mueller, who is investigating Russia's attack on our democracy during the 2016 election, and whether anyone from the Trump campaign was involved. But President Trump doesn't see it as an attack on our democracy, one that should be battled with all the weapons at our disposal. He sees it as an attack on him, on his legitimacy. He sees it as questioning his election victory. And if there's one thing Trump cannot tolerate, it's anybody who questions his most cherished belief, that he's a winner. I want to bring in now CNN political analyst Carl Bernstein, CNN presidential historian Douglas Brinkley, and CNN national security analyst Juliette Kayyem. Good evening, everyone. Happy Friday to you. Juliette, let's start with this breaking news tonight about the special counsel recommending up to 6 months of jail time for George Papadopoulos. Remember, he's the one who pleaded guilty to lying to investigators, but the special counsel is arguing that lies have consequences because they're saying he impeded the investigation and that his cooperation has been disappointing. What's your reaction?
So it's quite interesting and enlightening to see what happened with Papadopoulos, who's been sort of a hero of the resistance. A lot of people thought, oh, he's given this much information. It's clear from the documents tonight that were filed that he's been anything but, that he has not been forthcoming, that they actually believe him to be stalling on information. And the key point for your audience to know is that there was a professor who basically, Massoud, who basically was sort of a potentially central point of linking the Russians with the Trump campaign. He was in the United States, and Papadopoulos' lies essentially made it very difficult for the Mueller team to be able to interview him or to even detain him. He's now no longer in the United States, and they're unable to have those conversations with this professor. So it's based on one person and sort of a missed opportunity. But the bigger point is you don't lie, and even if you're lying and then you say you want to be helpful, if you're not helpful, we want you to go to jail.
So we now have 2 letters, Juliette, protesting Trump over the handling of the security clearances, one by 15 former senior intelligence officers, one by 60 former CIA officials. And I just want to read from this letter, from the second letter, okay? And it says, we believe equally strongly that former government officials have the right to express their unclassified views on what they see as critical national security issues without fear of being punished for doing so. So these 2 letters are a striking rebuke by 75 former officials who worked for Republican and Democratic administrations after Trump revoked John Brennan's clearance.
That's exactly right. So let me just begin with how sort of how odd this is for this group of people. Both letters, actually, mostly these are people that you and I have never heard of. They don't like to be in the rough and tumble of politics. They don't consider themselves political. But because the Trump presidency has been so undermining of America's not only legitimacy in the outside world, but of course our own internal national security when it comes to our voting integrity, they spoke up. I just, put it in perspective. Bill Shine, who's now the communications director director in charge of sort of hiding, decades of harassment at Fox News, and Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who essentially lies every day to the American public, a public that's paying for her. They're in charge of determining whose security clearances are going to be revoked at what time, right? Because the Trump people want it to be done at times in which he's facing bad news. And what they don't realize, right, not only is that absurd, the Trump White House every day is facing bad news. I mean, it's like the idea that they're waiting for some quiet. I mean, they're the bad news, right? I mean, it's not like the outside world's creating it for them. So we're going to see these happen. It's as you've heard all night, it's pathetic. I mean, in the end, it's just pathetic.
And it was striking to see the names are scrolling of the 60 people who signed the letter as you were there, speaking about it. Carl, I got to ask you, the Washington Post is reporting tonight that the White House has drafted more clearance cancellations, and I'm going to read from that. It says, Trump wants to sign most, if not all of them, said one senior White House official who indicated that communications aides, including Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders and Bill Shine, the newly named Deputy Chief of Staff, have discussed the optimum times to release them as a distraction during unfavorable news cycles. Julia touched on this a little bit. So they're going to be pulling these clearances and putting this information out when they need to distract from something that's blatantly political.
Of course it's blatantly political, but we have to go to the very basis of what Trump is doing here, and that is he is, as part of a cover-up, is trying to undermine and bury the Mueller investigation at every turn. And that includes through all this diversionary action. I've talked to people in the White House, lawyers involved, defending some former White House people in his administration, and all of them say that Trump is both in a panic right now about the Mueller investigation and where it is leading in terms of investigating collusion involving key members of his administration and his campaign, perhaps himself, perhaps his family. And we are also witnessing right now an unprecedented revolt. Let's look at what these statements by these 65 officials of the intelligence community really are. Since the establishment of the intelligence apparatus of this country in 1947 and 1948, there has never been anything like this. A revolt, let's call it for what it is, by the most highly regarded intelligence professionals against the conduct of the President of the United States. A stinging rebuke in which they picture him as a despot who does not believe in free speech. And that's really what this is partly about. It's part of enemies of the people and trying to characterize those who might question him as being enemies of the people.
Douglas Brinkley, I want to play this for you. This is John Brennan on MSNBC tonight, and then we'll talk about it. Here it is.
Okay. He's drunk on power. He really is. And I think he's abusing the powers of that office. I think right now this country is in a crisis in terms of what Mr. Trump has done and is liable to do. And so are the Republicans on the Hill who have given him a pass, are they going to wait for a disaster to happen before they actually find their backbones and spines to speak up against somebody who clearly is not carrying out his responsibilities?
What's your reaction, Douglas?
That Brennan is an American hero for speaking up. His tenure at CIA was impeccable. We owe him so much, and he's now leading the crusade, really, to tell people that Donald Trump is unfit for command. These are the best and the brightest, the wisest people on foreign policy and intelligence that are writing these letters, some out of retirement.